The hand pressed flat against the interior wall just after midnight, and the wood was warm. Not warm the way a stove makes a room warm. Not that radiant blast that hits you when you open a firebox door and pull back just as quick. This was something quieter. Something that came from the structure itself, from the stillness inside the timber, from the fact that the wall had been sitting in calm air for 6 hours while outside, 40 miles per hour of Wyoming wind tried everything it knew to get in. The hand belonged to Gunnar Reed. He stood in the dark of his finished cabin without a lamp, one palm pressed to the log surface, and he listened to the storm work itself to exhaustion against something it could not move. He had been in this exact position once before, in a different cabin, in a different winter, and the wall under his hand that night had been cold as iron. He had stood there and felt the cold coming through, and understood with a terrible clarity that no amount of fire was going to be enough. That was the winter of 1888. That was Minnesota. That was Ingrid. He pulled his hand back from the wall and stood in the dark a moment longer. Then he went to bed and slept without waking until dawn. 6 months earlier, on an April morning, when the ground was still showing its last gray patches of snow and the wind smelled like mud and distance, Gunnar Reed had arrived in Clearwater Flats, Wyoming territory, with 2 wooden trunks, a crosscut saw, a transit level, and a notebook containing 47 pages of measurements in his own small handwriting. He came by wagon from the rail station at Rawlins, sitting up beside a freight driver named Cord, who did not talk much and therefore suited Gunnar perfectly. The country opened up as they moved north, the red rock shelves giving way to open grassland that seemed to expand in every direction at once, and Gunnar sat on the wagon bench and watched it with the particular attention of a man cataloging what he sees rather than simply admiring it. He had been in Wyoming once before, briefly, passing through on his way back from a job in Colorado. He had noted then that the plains here were different from the plains in Minnesota. The wind in Minnesota came in from the northwest in winter, and it was cold and steady and punishing. The wind in Wyoming came from everywhere. There were no tree lines to slow it, no river bluffs to deflect it, no geography of consequence between a man's wall and the horizon. It was, Gunnar had noted in his book that first time through, a wind problem more than a cold problem. He filed a claim on 80 acres at Clearwater Flats in the first week of April. The land was flat and the soil was dark, and there was a shallow creek running along the eastern edge that would serve for water. He paid his fees and shook hands with the county registrar and drove stakes into the ground where his corners would be. His neighbors, such as they were spread across the distance in the way of all frontier homesteads, close enough to see smoke from each other's chimneys, far enough that you had to mean it to visit. The first man to come to his claim and introduce himself was Walter Briggs. Walt Briggs was 51 years old, built heavy through the shoulders with a gray beard cut close and eyes that had spent 2 decades squinting into Wyoming weather and showed it. He held the position of county land supervisor for Laramie District, which in practical terms meant he rode his circuit twice monthly, checked on claims, logged disputes, and functioned as the nearest thing to institutional authority that most of these homesteaders would encounter for months at a time. He rode a gray mare and sat well in the saddle, the kind of ease that comes from having lived on horseback since boyhood. Walt Briggs introduced himself and shook Gunnar's hand and looked over the claim with the proprietary assessment of a man who considered himself an authority on the land he administered. He pointed out the drainage pattern of the creek, identified a low spot that would flood in spring runoff, and noted that the prevailing winter winds came from the northwest, which meant Gunnar would want his door on the south face if he was smart. All of this was accurate and delivered with the generous confidence of a man sharing hard-won knowledge he genuinely believed would be useful. Gunnar listened and nodded at the appropriate moments and said thank you, and Walt Briggs rode off, satisfied that he had done his neighborly duty. By the end of April, Gunnar had his foundation stones in place. By mid-May, his logs were up. He worked steadily and without waste, and any man watching would have recognized the movements of someone who had built before and knew what he was doing. The cabin was 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep, with 9-foot walls and a sound roof. He chinked the gaps between the logs carefully, working mortar into every seam with a flat blade, tapping it flush, standing back to check his sight lines. When the chinking was done, and the door was hung, and the single window was set in its frame, he had a structure that was solid by the standards of the territory, competent and complete. He spent exactly 2 days inside it, sleeping in his bedroll and eating from his camp provisions, before he walked outside on the morning of the 3rd day and began setting cedar posts in a rectangle that sat 12 inches outside his finished log walls. The posts went in at 36-inch intervals, plumbed with the transit level and tamped solid. And by the second morning of this work, Walt Briggs was back on his gray mare, watching from 20 feet out. "Son," Walt said, "what in creation are you building now?" It was not quite a question. It had the cadence of a man who already suspected the answer was going to disappoint him. Gunnar looked up from his plumb line. "Storm wall," he said, "like they use for cold storage." Walt sat with this information for a moment. He took in the row of posts, sitting at their precise interval, the cabin wall behind them, the gap between. He spat on the ground beside his horse's front left hoof, which was his habitual punctuation when he had reached a verdict. "That is a fence around a house," Walt said. "You built yourself a fine cabin, and now you are building a fence around it." Gunnar checked the next post with the level, found it true, and moved on. Walt watched him work for another few minutes, then said, "I have wintered here since 1875. 15 seasons. A good wall with tight chinking and a proper stove is all any man needs." He said it with the weight of personal testimony, the kind of statement that does not invite argument, because it is rooted in lived experience and the speaker knows it. Gunnar straightened from the post hole and looked at Walt Briggs directly. "I appreciate that," he said. Then he went back to work. Walt rode off with the particular stiffness of a man whose advice has not been received in the spirit it was offered. He would be back. Gunnar knew he would be back, and he kept working. The frame for the outer wall took 4 days. Gunnar cut ledger blocks from 2x4 stock and nailed them between the posts every 48 inches to hold the rectangular frame rigid and true. At the base of the frame, he left a gap of 3/4 of an inch for drainage, and he screened it with woven wire to hold the fill material in place when the time came. At the top, under the eave overhang, he built from salvaged timber. He cut a 1/2-inch vent slot and screened that too, because what went into the cavity between the walls needed air movement to stay dry, but not the kind of air movement that would let the wind pump heat out. The outer skin went up in vertical planks, 1x10 rough-sawn boards from the mill at Rawlins that he had ordered in advance and paid a premium to have delivered. He ran them floor to eave and battened every seam with 1x3 strips spaced 16 inches apart, working his way around the perimeter in a methodical sequence, north face first, because that was the face that mattered most. He flashed the roofline with tin sheeting he had cut and bent himself, a drip edge that would carry snow melt away from the cavity below rather than letting it wick down into the fill material. For the windows and the door he built, hinged outer panels that could be secured in a storm or swung back for access during mild weather. When the outer skin was complete, the cabin looked, in the words of Nora Hatch, like something that could not quite decide whether it was a building or a stockade. Nora Hatch was the district school teacher and the secretary of the county education board, a position that gave her access to more official paper and more official ink than anyone else in Clearwater Flats, and which she used, among other things, to keep meticulous weather records for the territorial government. She was 34 and had been at Clearwater 4 years, and had learned early that survival in this country required both practical competence and careful observation. She had noted in her journal on multiple occasions that most of the men around her confused experience with understanding, that knowing what had always worked was not the same thing as knowing why it worked, and that this distinction mattered more in extreme weather than in almost any other circumstance. She stopped her wagon on the road past Gunnar's claim on a morning in early July and watched him nail battens along the east face of the outer wall, her horse standing patient in the traces while she studied the construction. She had noticed the structure evolving over the previous weeks and had delayed her visit because she was waiting until she had enough to look at to make the visit worthwhile. "Mr. Reed," she called out, "you mind if I ask what the gap is for?" Gunnar climbed down from the scaffolding board he was standing on and walked to the road. He looked at the gap between the finished outer planks and the log wall behind them, and he said, "Dead air. Moving air steals heat. Trapped air holds it." Nora considered this. She looked at the outer wall, then at the strip of shadow behind it, where the log surface waited in its calm interior space. She had read something once, in a farming journal from Iowa, about the insulation principles used in commercial ice storage facilities. She had read it idly and filed it away without expecting it to be relevant to her life. Now it surfaced. "Like an ice house," she said. Gunnar looked at her with slightly more attention than he had been paying. "Yes," he said, "exactly like an ice house." She asked him several more questions, specific and technical, and he answered them without impatience, which was itself notable, because most men in her experience either dismissed her technical questions or answered them in the simplified way they used when talking to someone they did not expect to understand. He talked to her the way he would have talked to another builder, with measurements and material specifications and a brief explanation of the vent function at the eaves. When she drove on, she wrote in her journal that evening that the Swede was doing something worth watching. She had initially assumed from his accent and manner that he was Norwegian, the way people assume the familiar when they encounter the unfamiliar, but he had corrected her gently when she asked. "Swedish," he had said, "from the coast. It matters because the coast teaches you things about wind that the inland never does." He was from a coastal city where his father had worked in ship timber and his grandfather before him, and where the winters came off the Baltic with a steady cold that had been teaching the people there for generations that a wall was only as good as what you understood about what was on the other side of it. He had trained formally as a structural carpenter and had spent 8 years working construction in Minneapolis and then in the growing industrial districts around Duluth. And for the last 3 of those years, he had contracted exclusively for cold storage facilities, the large commercial ice houses that served the meatpacking and brewing industries of the upper Midwest. He had learned from the ice house foremen, practical men who had no interest in theory but tremendous interest in results, that the enemy of cold storage was not temperature but air circulation. Moving air carried heat. Still, air resisted it. The way to keep cold in was to use fibrous materials that broke down any circulating air mass into pockets so small they could not carry heat efficiently, and then to layer those pockets behind a sacrificial outer structure that took whatever weather hit it before it could reach the insulated inner wall. He had built these systems for 3 years, and they had worked without exception. And he had known from the moment he drove his first homestead stake into Wyoming soil that he was going to build one for himself. What he had not told Walt Briggs, and had not told Nora Hatch, and had not told anyone in Clearwater Flats because no one had asked the right question in the right way yet, was why it mattered to him so much. Why a man who could have built a standard cabin and lived a standard homesteader's winter felt that he could not, under any circumstances, do that. The answer was Ingrid. They had been married 11 years when she died. They had come from the same coastal province in Sweden, had known each other from childhood, had married young, and worked together through the early lean years in Minneapolis, and then through the better years that followed, when his work was steady and their house was paid for, and they had begun to talk about the future with the tentative confidence of people who believe they have earned some right to make plans. She had wanted land, not city property, not a neighborhood lot with its neighbor's fence 6 feet from your window, but actual land, the kind that extended past what you could see from your doorstep. He had agreed because he loved her, and because he thought he understood what she meant, that openness and quiet and the sense of one's life having physical room to exist in. They had moved to Minnesota in the autumn of 1887, to a homestead claim outside a small settlement 200 miles northwest of Minneapolis, and they had arrived too late in the season to build what Gunnar would have considered a proper structure. He had built them a single-wall cabin in 6 weeks, working fast, chinking carefully, doing the best work he could do in the time available. It was a good cabin by the standards of the region. It was what everyone around him had, and what everyone around him considered sufficient. In January of 1888, Ingrid developed a cough. It was not a serious cough at first, the kind of winter cough that a body acquires in cold, dry air, and that usually resolves when the weather turns. But the cabin was never truly warm. The stove was adequate, the firewood was sufficient, and yet the cold came through the logs at night in a way that no amount of burning fully addressed, because the problem was not the fire. The problem was the wind working through the chinking, displacing warm air with cold air, creating a slow, steady drain that required constant replenishment. He had fed that fire through every cold night that January, and the cabin had held at somewhere between 40 and 45 degrees at floor level while he slept. And Ingrid's cough had settled deeper into her chest, and by the 3rd week of the month, she had a fever. He had pressed his hand to the wall one night while she slept badly behind him, and the wall was cold. Not ice cold, but the kind of cold that tells you the structure is losing the argument with the weather. He had stood there and understood, with the clarity of a man who builds for a living and therefore knows what he is looking at, that the wall was failing them. Not catastrophically, not in a way that a neighbor or a doctor would identify as negligence, just steadily, invisibly, at the cellular level of chinking and log surface and absorbed cold that radiated back inward all night long. Ingrid died on February 4th. The doctor said pneumonia. Gunnar knew the cabin had not caused it the way a gun causes a wound, but he knew with equal certainty that a different structure might have given her body the warmth it needed to fight. He had known how to build that structure. He had built it commercially, for businesses, for institutions. He had not built it for his wife because he had been in a hurry, and because it was not what people built for homes, and because no one would have understood why he thought it was necessary. He had come to Wyoming to never make that choice again. He was standing inside the partially filled cavity of his outer wall on an afternoon in late August, tamping loose hay with a wooden block he had shaped for the purpose, when he heard footsteps coming along the outer face of the planking, and then a voice that was not Walt Briggs and not Nora Hatch. The voice said, "The fill density looks low on the north section." Gunnar stopped tamping. He stepped out through the access panel he had cut in the east face for exactly this purpose, and found a young man standing in the September light, looking at the outer wall with a notebook under his arm and an expression of genuine technical interest. The young man was maybe 19 or 20, built like someone who had been doing physical work all his life, but had recently spent a year or two mostly sitting at a desk, the outdoors muscles still there under a layer of pallor that came from indoor study. He had Walt Briggs' jawline and Walt Briggs's direct way of looking at a thing, but his eyes were different, less settled, more alive to the possibility that he might be wrong about what he was seeing. "Thomas Briggs," the young man said. He put out his hand. Gunnar shook it. "Reed," he said. "I know who you are," Thomas said. "I have been watching the construction from the road for about 3 weeks." He said it without apology or embarrassment, the way someone states a fact that is relevant to the conversation. "I graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in June. Civil and structural program." He paused. "Your cavity spacing is correct for the fill material you are using, but on the north face, based on what I can see of the settled depth, I think you have got a gap forming in the upper third." Gunnar looked at him for a moment, then he handed him the tamping block and said, "Show me." They worked together for 2 hours. Thomas was right about the north face gap, and the correction took 40 minutes of careful repacking to address. They worked without conversation, except for the occasional technical exchange, the shorthand of 2 people focused on the same problem, and Gunnar noted that the young man's hands knew what to do with a tool, that his measurements were precise, and that he did not talk when he had nothing useful to say. When the north section was properly tamped and the access panel was back in place, they stood in the flat evening light, and Thomas said, "My father thinks this is a waste of lumber." "I know," Gunnar said. Thomas looked at the outer wall for a moment, then at the log surface visible in the shadow behind it. He said, "My father is a good man. He knows this country. He just knows what has worked before, and he cannot see past that to what might work better." He said it carefully, the way a son speaks about a father he respects but has moved beyond in some specific way, not with superiority, just with the particular sadness of having gone somewhere the other person has not gone yet. Gunnar said nothing. Thomas said, "Can you show me the full system? The ventilation, the fill ratios, the moisture management, all of it." They went inside, and Gunnar lit the lamp and opened his notebook on the table. And for 3 hours, he walked Thomas Briggs through 14 months of notes and calculations developed from his icehouse work and adapted for residential application. Thomas asked good questions. He understood the physics intuitively, could follow the reasoning from first principles rather than needing it translated into simpler terms. And twice, he caught implications in Gunnar's notes that Gunnar had not thought to articulate because he had always considered them obvious. At 10 o'clock, Thomas put on his coat and picked up his own notebook, which he had been filling steadily throughout the evening. He said, "I will not tell my father I was here tonight." Gunnar said, "That is between you and your father." Thomas nodded and went out into the dark, and Gunnar heard his horse's footsteps receding across the flat ground toward the Briggs homestead 1.5 miles north. He sat at his table for a while after that, looking at his own notebook, and he thought about what it meant that a young man would come in secret to learn something his father had publicly dismissed. He thought about the gap between what a man knew from experience and what a man knew from understanding, and whether the two things were always as close as the man experiencing them believed. He thought about Walt Briggs riding his circuit for 15 Wyoming winters, surviving them all on the strength of a single wall and a good stove, never knowing that survival and comfort were not the same measurement, and that the system he relied on had thresholds he had simply never been forced to discover because the worst winters of his tenure had not quite crossed them. And he thought about Ingrid, which he tried not to do too often during the working hours because the thought of her during work hours made his hands less precise, and precision was the thing he had, at this point in his life, the thing he offered to the world in place of the other things he no longer had. He set down the notebook and went to bed. September came in dry and bright, and the work went forward. Gunnar finished filling the cavity, tamping each section to approximately 3 pounds per cubic foot, light enough to trap maximum air, dense enough to stay in place through the seasons. He tacked muslin at the top of each wall section as a wind check to prevent the fill from settling and leaving cold gaps near the eaves, where the greatest temperature differential would exist in winter. He covered the fill with a second layer of muslin on the interior face of the cavity, not structurally necessary, but useful as an additional barrier against any air movement that might find its way through the outer planking at a weak batten joint. He built a small vestibule around the south door, a 3-foot-deep airlock with its own door that opened outward. The principle was simple. Any time a person entered or exited, only one door was open at a time, which meant the interior of the cabin was never directly exposed to outside air during entry. It was the same principle used in cold storage loading docks, where the differential between interior and exterior temperature was so extreme that uncontrolled air exchange would have defeated the entire system in minutes. For a house in Wyoming winter, the calculation was less extreme, but the physics were identical. Walt Briggs made 2 more visits during September. The first time he looked at the outer wall, with the battens in place and the vestibule taking shape, and shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man who has passed through disbelief and arrived at a kind of resigned bewilderment. You are 2 months behind where a man should be at this point in the season, he said. Sod is not broken. Fence posts are not in. You have been building a second wall around a house that already has one. Gunnar acknowledged the accuracy of this observation. The sod would wait. The fence posts would wait. The winter would not wait. And the second wall would be ready before the winter arrived. Walt shook his head again. One good wall with tight chinking, he said. That is all any man in this territory has ever needed. He rode off. He returned 10 days later with the same verdict and the same tone, and Gunnar gave him the same civil acknowledgement and the same non-answer. And Walt Briggs' exasperation reached a new elevation that expressed itself as a kind of territorial official concern, a suggestion that perhaps the county board should know that one of its newer claimants was spending his preparation months on structural experiments rather than the practical work of establishing a viable homestead. Gunnar said, "I appreciate you riding out, Mr. Briggs." He returned to his work. In the second week of September, during the hours between the end of the working day and full dark, Gunnar had begun making a different kind of visit. There was a man who came to the Clearwater trading post every 10 days or so from the Arapaho encampment 17 miles to the southwest, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 55, who sold worked leather and hand-stitched moccasins of remarkable quality, and who went by the name Iron Shirt, which was what he had offered when asked, and which Gunnar suspected was a translation rather than a given name, though he did not ask. Iron Shirt spoke English with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned it as an adult and chose his words accordingly. He was not expansive, but he was willing to talk to a man who asked specific questions and listened carefully to the answers. Gunnar had seen Arapaho lodges on his way through Wyoming 2 years earlier. He had noticed something about their construction that stayed with him. A double-walled quality, an inner lining of worked hide suspended from the lodge poles a foot or more inside the outer covering, creating a gap, a band of enclosed air between the people and the weather. He had filed this observation in the same part of his thinking, where he filed Icehouse Principles. Under the heading of things that worked and deserved understanding, he asked Ironshirt about the liner. Ironshirt looked at him with the measured consideration of a man deciding whether the question deserved a real answer. Then he said, "The wind is always trying to get to the people. The outer skin lets the wind fight itself. The people live in the quiet." Gunnar wrote this down that evening, not because he needed the reminder, but because the phrasing was exact in a way that his own technical language was not. The people live in the quiet. That was what the double wall created. Not warmth precisely, not insulation exactly, quiet, stillness, the absence of movement in the air layer that surrounded the living space, so that the heat produced by the people inside could stay with the people instead of being carried away by circulation. He wrote it down and underlined it, and then he wrote beneath it, in his small, careful hand, "Ingrid would have liked this." He closed the notebook. October arrived with the sky that went pale and high, and the particular flat light that experienced plains people recognized as the beginning of the long season. The grass went yellow-brown overnight. The creek developed a skim of ice on its edges in the early mornings that pulled back as the sun rose, but came a little further in each successive day, a patient encroachment. Birds that had been present through September disappeared between one morning and the next. The wind, which had been manageable through the warm months, found a new register, lower in pitch, steadier in duration. The kind of wind that does not gust so much as lean. By the 1st of October, Gunnar's system was complete. The outer wall was sound on all four faces. The fill was tamped and stabilized. The vent slots were screened. The vestibule was in place, with both doors operating smoothly. He had stacked his firewood under the lean-to he had built against the east face. 14 cords, more than he expected to need, because he had learned from the ice houses that the more effective your insulation, the less fuel you burned. But you still wanted the fuel there, present and counted, because weather did not care about your calculations and only asked whether you were ready. He walked the perimeter of his structure on the evening of October 3rd, checking the batten joints in the fading light, pressing his fingers into the seams, looking for any gap that the first hard wind would find before he did. He found 2 places on the south face where a batten had not seated fully against the plank beneath it, and he nailed them down with 4 additional spikes each, driving them in with the steady rhythm of a man finishing work that needed to be finished. When he came around the north face for the last time, he stopped. Walt Briggs was sitting on his horse at the edge of the claim, not speaking, just watching him work in the last light. There was something different in the man's posture this time. Not conciliation, not approval, nothing that would be mistaken for either of those things. But the aggressive certainty of the earlier visits was absent. He was simply watching, the way a man watches something he cannot entirely account for. They looked at each other across the distance of the claim for a moment. Then Walt turned his horse and rode north without saying anything. Gunnar watched him go. He understood something about that silence. It was not a man who had been convinced. It was a man who had run out of the particular energy that dismissal requires and who was now simply waiting for the winter to deliver its verdict. Walt Briggs had spent 15 years being right about this country. He was not ready to be wrong. But he was, for the first time since April, no longer entirely sure. That night, Gunnar sat at his table and wrote the date in his notebook, October 3rd, 1889. And beneath it he wrote the outdoor temperature from the thermometer he had mounted on a north-facing post away from any structure, and the indoor temperature at the interior log surface, and the indoor temperature at the center of the room, and the amount of wood he had burned since sunrise. He wrote these 4 numbers in a careful column and drew a line beneath them, and he started a new column for the following day. He had done this before. In the ice houses, the foreman kept temperature logs to verify that the insulation was performing to specification and to catch any degradation before the stored product was affected. The same logic applied here. Numbers were not opinions. Numbers did not lose arguments. When the winter came and someone asked how the cabin had performed, he would have answers that were precise and dated and could not be dismissed the way a claim or an impression could be dismissed. He capped his pen and looked at the single lamp flame, bending slightly in a draft from somewhere, a small movement, almost nothing, but he noted it, and he would find its source in the morning. In his system, almost nothing was still something. Almost nothing was the beginning of a problem. He had learned that in the ice houses, and he had confirmed it in Minnesota, and he lived by it now with the commitment of a man who understood the cost of being wrong. Outside, the wind moved across the flat country from the northwest, steady and patient, trying every seam it could find. The outer wall took the force of it. Behind the planks and the battens and the 12 inches of still air and packed hay and moss, the log wall of Gunnar Reed's cabin stood in a quiet that was not silence, but stillness, the particular stillness of air that has nowhere to go and nothing to carry. He banked the stove for the night and went to bed. The first serious storm of the season arrived on the 14th of October, 2 weeks earlier than any old-timer in Clearwater Flats would have predicted, based on the patterns of the previous 15 years. It came in from the northwest with the kind of speed that suggests the sky has been building toward this for some time and has simply been waiting for the right alignment of pressures to release it. By midnight, the wind was measured at 40 miles per hour by the station anemometer at the county road office, and the temperature outside was reading 22 below zero. Walt Briggs woke at 3 in the morning to a sound he had heard before and never found a way to grow comfortable with, the particular high-pitched working of wind through chinking gaps, a thin, persistent whistle that meant the seal between inside and outside had been compromised and that the cold was not waiting at the door but already inside, moving through the room at floor level where it pooled and stayed. He built his fire back up from banked coals and sat close to the stove in his coat and felt the heat radiating forward toward him, while behind him, 6 feet back, the room was barely above freezing. He had a thermometer on the wall, and he walked to it and read it, and it said 38 degrees, inside, with a good stove running full. He thought about the Swede and his fence around a house. He thought about Thomas, who had gone to bed early that evening without the usual round of conversation, and who had been quieter than normal for the past 3 weeks, carrying something he was not saying. Walt fed his stove and waited for morning. In the cabin of August Heller, who was 74 and a veteran of Chickamauga and 4 Wyoming winters, and who had lungs that Dr. Helen Foss had quietly described in her records as functionally compromised, the night was something more serious than uncomfortable. August had his stove running as high as it would safely go, and he was still cold. The cold was in the logs around him, absorbed through days of exposure, and now radiating back inward regardless of what the fire did. A thermal debt the structure had accumulated over the past week of gradually dropping temperatures that no single night's burning could repay. He coughed in his sleep, a deep rattling pull that moved in his chest like something loose, and woke himself, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind work against his walls with a steady, indifferent force. He was a man who did not complain and did not ask for help, who had carried himself through harder circumstances than this with the discipline of someone who had decided long ago that endurance was a form of dignity. But lying there in the dark, with the cold coming through the logs and his lungs aching with each breath, he thought about the spring and whether he would see it, and the thought had a weight to it that it had not carried before. Nora Hatch, half a mile to the south, was awake and recording. She had mounted 2 thermometers on her cabin wall, one at floor level and one at shoulder height, and she was logging readings every hour through the night, with the methodical commitment of someone who understood that a data point missed was a data point gone forever. At 3 in the morning, her floor thermometer read 31 degrees. At 4, it read 29. At 5 in the morning, with her stove burning steadily and her supply of split wood diminishing at a rate that concerned her, it read 30 degrees. The cabin was gaining nothing. It was simply spending fuel to hold a position. She wrote in her journal, "Wind sustained at what feels like 40 miles per hour or above. Single wall construction appears unable to overcome infiltration under these conditions, regardless of stove output. Reed's structure warrants examination at earliest opportunity. If his interior readings are substantially different from mine, the implications for construction practice in this region are significant." She put down her pen. She looked at the frost that had formed on the interior log surface nearest the north wall, a crystalline coating that grew a little thicker each hour, and she thought about what it meant that a wall could ice on its inside face while a stove burned 6 feet away. She thought it meant that the wall was not a barrier, it was a conductor, and a conductor, in this kind of cold, was simply an enemy you had decided to live inside. 3 miles to the northeast, in the cabin that now sat inside its outer skin of rough-sawn plank and battened seam and 12 inches of packed still air, Gunnar Reed's stove had been banked since midnight. He had not fed it since 11 in the evening. He was asleep. The wind that was finding every flaw in every other structure in Clearwater Flats was hitting the outer planks of his exterior wall, spending itself against that surface, losing pressure in the 12-inch cavity, and arriving at the log wall behind it as something closer to stillness than force. The hay and moss in the cavity wall trapped the cold air that found its way through the outer planking in tiny fibrous pockets, too small and too still to carry any meaningful heat away from the structure. The log wall, sitting in that relative calm, stayed at a temperature that was cold by summer standards and warm by the standard of the night outside. The interior of the cabin, 3 hours after the last wood had been added to the fire, read 49 degrees at floor level. Water in the pail by the door was liquid. Gunnar slept without waking until the grey dawn came pale through the single window, and he lay in his bedroll for a moment, the way a man does when he is aware of waking and not yet fully in the day. And he heard the wind still going outside, and he felt the temperature of the air against his face, and he knew without reaching for the thermometer what the night had done and what the night had not been able to do. He rose and dressed and recorded his numbers. He added a small log to the coals and watched it catch, and then he put on his coat and walked outside into the teeth of the October storm to check every batten and every vent and every seam on his outer wall, because a system only deserved confidence when it had been verified, and verification was not a feeling. It was a number. And his numbers, this morning, were exactly what he had calculated they would be. The storm lasted 4 days. Not 4 days of the same intensity, but 4 days of the same intention. The wind holding its direction and its purpose with a consistency that felt personal to the people it was working against. It would ease for an hour or two in the afternoons, dropping to something almost manageable, and then by evening it would return to its full register that sustained 40-mile-per-hour pressure that found every weakness in every structure it touched and did not stop finding them until it had extracted every degree of warmth it could reach. By the second morning, Walt Briggs had burned through his full evening wood allocation and half of the next day's supply. He stood at his stove feeding it split pine in pieces he had not intended to use until January, and he did the arithmetic in his head, and he did not like where the arithmetic ended up. His interior temperature at floor level had not risen above 40 degrees since midnight of the first night. His water pail had a skim of ice across the top each morning, despite sitting on a shelf 3 feet above the floor and 4 feet from the stove. His walls wore a faint coating of frost on the interior log surfaces wherever the chinking was thinnest, a white crystalline bloom that appeared each night and that he scraped off each morning with the back of a spoon and that reappeared the following night without fail. He was not a man who suffered quietly, but he was a man who suffered privately, and those are not the same thing. He did not say anything to Thomas about the temperature readings or the wood consumption or the ice in the water pail. He simply got up each morning and managed what needed managing and told himself what he had told himself for 15 Wyoming winters, that this was the nature of the country and a man adapted to it, and that was the end of the discussion. Thomas said nothing either. He had his own calculations. He had measured the interior temperature at floor level on the second morning and written the number in his notebook, and then he had written beneath it the number he had calculated for Gunnar Reed's cabin, based on the system Gunnar had walked him through. And the difference between those two numbers sat in his mind through the day like a stone in a boot, present with every step. On the third morning of the storm, Walt Briggs put on his coat and his hat and his wool scarf and his heavy gloves, and he walked out into the October cold, and he got on his horse. Thomas watched him go from the window. He knew where his father was going. He had known this moment was coming since the first night of the storm, when he had watched his father stand at the thermometer for a long time without writing anything down. Walt rode south into the wind, which was the worst direction to ride in a Wyoming blizzard, but also the direction of Gunnar Reed's claim. The horse moved with its head low and its ears back, the long-suffering cooperation of an animal that trusted its rider even when the rider's decisions were questionable. The ground between the Briggs homestead and Reed's claim was open country with nothing to break the wind, and Walt leaned into it and kept the horse moving at a steady walk and arrived at the outer wall of Gunnar's structure 20 minutes later with ice in his beard and his eyes watering from the cold. He stood outside for a moment and looked at the structure. From the outside, it was a rough thing. Vertical planks with their battened seams, the tin flashing along the roofline, the screened vent slot under the eave, the vestibule door with its simple wooden latch. It was not elegant. It had not been built to impress anyone. It had been built to function under exactly the conditions that were currently occurring. And Walt Briggs stood outside it in the wind. And he knew, with the bone-level certainty of a man who had spent 15 winters reading structures, that whatever was happening on the other side of those planks was different from what was happening in his own cabin right now. He opened the vestibule door and stepped into the small enclosed space between the two doors. The wind disappeared, not diminished. gone. The vestibule was 3 feet deep, and the outer door sat flush in its frame, and the space inside was absolutely still. He stood there for a moment in that stillness, which after 3 days of sustained wind felt almost hallucinatory, and then he opened the inner door and stepped into the cabin. Gunnar was at his table writing in his notebook. He looked up when the inner door opened, and he did not look surprised. He said, "Mr. Briggs." He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of fact with no judgment attached to it. Walt closed the inner door behind him. He took off his gloves and unwound his scarf, and he looked around the cabin. His eyes went immediately to the thermometer on the wall, which was a reflex, the thing he did in every structure he entered in cold weather, because the thermometer told you everything you needed to know about how a building was doing its job. The thermometer read 53 degrees. He stood and looked at it. He had his own thermometer reading clear in his mind. The 40 degrees his stove was barely sustaining after burning a day and a half more wood than he had planned to burn. He looked at the thermometer on Gunnar's wall for a long time without speaking. Then he walked to the interior log surface on the north wall and put his bare hand against it. He had done this in his own cabin 2 mornings ago, and the log had been cold enough to make him pull his hand back. Here the log was cool, not warm, not heated by proximity to the stove. Cool the way a stone is cool in shade, not the aggressive cold of a surface that is conducting exterior temperature directly through its mass. He put his hand against it and held it there. Gunnar watched him from the table. He did not say anything. He understood what was happening, and he understood that words were the wrong instrument for this moment. Walt finally pulled his hand back. He looked at it. He looked at the log surface. He said, quietly, as though speaking to himself more than to anyone else in the room, "How long since you fed that fire?" "Since 9 this morning," Gunnar said. It was now past 2 in the afternoon. Walt looked at the stove. It was holding a bed of coals, not actively burning. It was doing what a banked fire does, maintaining rather than producing. Walt said nothing else for a while. He stood in the middle of Gunnar's cabin, with his coat still on and his hat still on, a man who had ridden through a blizzard with the intention of checking on his neighbor and who had found something he had not expected to find and was now standing inside his own reconsideration of it. He went to the table and sat down across from Gunnar without being invited, which was a frontier courtesy that both men understood. He looked at the open notebook, the columns of numbers, the dates running down the left margin. He could see the temperature readings without needing to ask what they were. And he sat there and he did his own arithmetic with them, the same arithmetic Thomas had been doing for 3 days in silence. He said, finally, "What is your wood burn for the day?" Gunnar told him, 3 pieces of split oak in the morning, a small feed at noon, nothing since. Walt was quiet. He was thinking about the cord and a half he had burned since the storm started and the 38-degree interior he had bought with it. He was thinking about a simple equation between fuel in and warmth out that he had never had cause to question in 15 years because the winters had never required him to question it, had never pushed hard enough or long enough to reveal the point at which his single wall stopped being adequate and started being a liability. He stood up. He put his gloves back on. He said, "I need to get back before dark." Gunnar nodded. Walt walked to the inner door, and then he stopped. He stood with his hand on the latch, and he did not turn around. He said, in a voice that was lower than the one he had been using, something that had been drained out of it, "The differential between my place and this one. What do you think it runs?" Gunnar looked at his notebook. He said, "At sustained wind above 35 miles per hour, based on what I have recorded so far, The difference between a single wall structure with standard chinking and this configuration is between 18 and 22 degrees Fahrenheit at interior floor level. Walt stood at the door with his hand on the latch. Then he opened it and walked through the vestibule and out into the storm without looking back. Gunnar sat at his table and listened to the wind return as the outer door opened and then disappear again as it closed. He looked at the numbers in his notebook. He thought about the expression on Walt Briggs' face when he put his hand on the north log wall and held it there. Not disbelief. Something more complicated than disbelief. A man confronting the gap between what he has been certain of and what the evidence is currently demonstrating, and finding that the gap is large enough to stand in. He picked up his pen and continued writing. Thomas was at the window when his father came back. He watched Walt dismount and put the horse in the lean-to and come inside without taking his coat off, just standing in the middle of the room, the way he had been standing since he got home. A man still in motion, even when he was standing still. Thomas asked where he had been, and Walt said, Reed's place, and nothing more, and went to the stove and fed it 3 pieces of wood and stood watching them catch. Thomas waited. Walt said, without turning around, he is running 53 degrees off a banked fire. Thomas said, I know. Walt turned. Then he looked at his son for a moment, taking in the fact of Thomas knowing this, the implications of Thomas knowing this, what it meant that Thomas knew and had not said anything. He was not angry. He was a man doing a fast accounting of the recent past through a different lens than the one he had been using. He said, How long have you known? Thomas said, Since September. He told him about the evening in October when he had gone to Reed's cabin with his notebook, and he told it straight, without apology, because he was his father's son, and the Briggs' approach to a difficult admission was directness rather than negotiation. Walt listened to all of it. He sat down when Thomas was finished. He looked at the stove, which was burning hard now, working against the same infiltration it had been working against for 4 days. He said, You should have told me. Thomas said, I know. I did not know how to tell you something you had already decided was wrong. This sat between them for a moment. Then Walt said, You could have told me anyway. Thomas said, Yes, sir. Walt nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something that could not be changed and choosing not to waste time on it. He said, After the storm, I want to see the full system, every part of it. Thomas said, I can take you through it. I have the full notes. Walt looked at him. He said, I want Reed to take me through it. Thomas understood what this cost his father. To go to the man he had dismissed publicly for 6 months and ask to be taught. To do that as Walter Briggs, county land supervisor, the man who had spent 15 Wyoming winters telling people what they needed to know about surviving in this country. He understood it, and he did not say anything about it, which was also a form of respect. The storm broke on the 4th day with a clarity that felt abrupt after so much sustained pressure. The wind simply stopping, the sky going blue and hard and still, the temperature dropping another 10 degrees as the cloud cover cleared. It was the kind of post-storm cold that was in some ways more dangerous than the storm itself. The still air and the bright sun, creating a false sense of accessibility while the actual temperature sat at 35 below zero, and the ground was covered in drifts that reached window level in the places where the wind had deposited its full load. In the days that followed, before the second storm showed itself on the horizon, Nora Hatch rode her circuit through the settlement with her notebook and her thermometer, and she did what she always did when the data was telling her something important. She collected more of it. She visited 6 cabins in 3 days, starting at the furthest claims and working her way back toward Gunnar's, because she wanted the full picture of what the October storm had done, before she added the one anomalous data point that she suspected would make all the other numbers looked different by comparison. At the Brenner place, William Brenner had burned through nearly 2 full cords of wood in the 4 days of the storm, and his interior had not risen above 42 degrees at night. His wife had slept in her coat for 3 days straight, and his youngest boy had developed an ear infection from the sustained cold that Dr. Helen Foss was treating with the limited materials available. At the Sandoval claim, the family had moved all 3 children into the single bedroom and hung blankets across the doorway and concentrated their fire and their body heat into the smallest possible space, a sensible adaptation that had kept them at 47 degrees in that one room while the rest of the cabin sat at 33. At the Morrison place, where an elderly couple in their late 60s had wintered here for 12 years and considered themselves experienced, the woman told Nora flatly that this had been the hardest October she could remember, and that if January was worse, she did not know what they would do. Her husband said nothing. He sat by his stove and looked at the woodpile through the window and said nothing. She documented the Colton cabin last among the standard structures, the one that James and Margaret Colton had built in August when they were still new enough to the territory to underestimate what new here meant. They had put up a sound single-wall structure in 6 weeks with the help of 2 neighbors, and during the October storm, they had managed barely by burning more wood than they had planned to burn and keeping May wrapped in every piece of wool they owned and checking her breathing in the night the way parents check a baby's breathing when they are frightened. May was 7 months old and had been born 7 weeks early, and her lungs had a particular vulnerability to cold air that Dr. Foss had flagged in September, and that the October storm had not quite exploited but had come close enough to that Margaret Colton had slept perhaps 4 full hours in 4 days. Nora wrote all of it down before she went to Gunnar's. She arrived at his door with her notebook already full of numbers from 6 other structures, and when she sat at his table and compared those numbers with his, the difference was not subtle. It was stark in the way that a gap between what a thing is and what it could be is always stark when someone finally measures it directly. The differential between his interior floor temperature and hers over the 4 days of the storm averaged 19.3 degrees, she said. You burned approximately 40% less wood than I did to achieve an interior temperature that was 19 degrees warmer. He said, a little under 40%, yes. She wrote in her notebook for a while. Then she said, I am going to write a report for the Territorial Education Office. I submit weather data to them quarterly, and they have been asking for construction recommendations for rural schoolhouses. She paused. This is a construction recommendation. Gunnar said, I can give you the full specification. Cavity width, fill density, ventilation ratios, material costs, everything you would need. She said, I would like that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Reed, may I ask you something personal? He looked at her. She said, you built this for a reason that goes beyond the practical. I have been around enough people to recognize when someone is doing a thing because they have to rather than because they want to. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about Ingrid, as briefly as he could manage, the Minnesota winter and the single wall and the cold coming through the logs and the fever that had not broken. He told it without self-pity, in the same measured tone he used for everything. But she could hear under it the thing that did not go away, the particular grief of a competent man who understood exactly what he had failed to do and why. When he was finished, she said, I am sorry. He nodded. She said, she would have been warmer here. He said, yes, she would have. They sat for a moment, in the particular quiet of a shared understanding that does not require more words. And then Nora opened her notebook again, and they returned to the specifications. It was 3 days after the first storm broke, on a morning when the sky was clear and the ground was hard with crusted snow, that Dr. Helen Foss rode out to the hatch cabin and asked if they could speak privately. Helen Foss was 43 and had been the only physician within 60 miles of Clearwater Flats for 6 years, a distinction that had given her an intimate and unglamorous education in what this country's winters did to human bodies that were not adequately protected from them. She was a direct woman, which her patients sometimes mistook for coldness, but which was actually the professional clarity of someone who had learned that ambiguity in medical communication cost time that people sometimes did not have. She sat across from Nora at the table, and she said, "August Heller is not going to survive another winter in that cabin." Nora put down her pen. Helen said, "His lungs have been deteriorating since Chickamauga. He took a chest wound in 1863, and the tissue has never fully recovered. He manages well enough in summer, but each winter takes something from him that does not come back. After this last storm, I examined him, and his respiratory function has declined measurably. He is coughing blood in the mornings. He has not told anyone this. He told me because I asked directly." Nora said, "What does he need?" Helen said, "He needs a structure that maintains interior temperatures above 45 degrees throughout the night without requiring him to wake every 2 hours to feed a fire. In his current cabin, that is not possible in a Wyoming January. The infiltration in that structure is severe enough that his stove cannot compensate for it during sustained cold, and the physical exertion of managing the fire is itself a strain on his respiratory system." Nora said, "What you are describing is exactly what Reed's structure provides." Helen said, "I know. I went and looked at it yesterday. I am not a builder, but I understand the principle and I understand the numbers." She paused. "The question is not whether the solution exists. The question is whether it can be implemented before January." They looked at each other across the table with the shared understanding of two women in a frontier community who had been solving problems with inadequate resources for long enough to know that the gap between a solution existing and a solution being available was often where people died. Nora said, "We need to talk to Briggs." Helen said, "Walt Briggs spent the last storm burning a cord and a half of wood to maintain 38 degrees in his cabin." She said it without satisfaction. "I think Walt Briggs may be ready to talk." She was right. What neither of them knew yet was the thing Walt Briggs had not told anyone in Clearwater Flats, the weight he had been carrying that made his dismissal of Gunnar Reed more ferocious than simple stubbornness could explain. The source of the particular energy he had brought to a disagreement that, from the outside, looked like just a neighbor building differently than was customary. Nora put away her notebook and rode home through the November cold, which was settling in with the particular permanence of a season that has made its decision and is done with the transition. And she thought about all the people in all the cabins she had visited that week, the Brenners and the Sandoval's and the Morrisons and the Coltons, and about the fact that the solution to what they were experiencing was available, had been available since April, had been standing on Reed's claim in plain sight for anyone who wanted to look at it. The only thing that had stood between the community and that solution was the confidence of a man who knew what had always worked and could not see past it to what might work better. She did not blame Walt Briggs for that. She understood how a person becomes the thing they know. She just hoped the winter would not require people to pay too high a price for the distance between knowing and understanding. The second storm came in the first week of November. It was not a question this time. The first storm had been an argument. The second storm was a verdict. It arrived with 45-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that dropped within the first night to 38 below zero, and it did not stop for 9 days. The snow it carried was not the dry powder of the October storm, which blew and drifted but could be managed, but a denser, wetter accumulation that packed into every gap and seam, and that when it melted and refroze became ice rather than snow, sealing some gaps permanently and forcing others wider as the water expanded. By the second morning, the Colton family was in crisis. James and Margaret Colton had arrived at Clearwater Flats in August, the youngest family in the township. James at 28 and Margaret at 26, with their daughter May, who had been born in June, 7 weeks early, in a Rawlins hospital that they had barely reached in time. May had come into the world small and quick-breathing, a child whose lungs had not quite finished their formation when the world required her to use them. She had gained weight through the summer, and her color had improved, and Dr. Foss had told Margaret in September that May was doing well, that the early arrival had not permanently compromised her, that a normal Wyoming winter in a sound cabin would not present any particular risk. A sound cabin was not what the Coltons had. They had built quickly in August with materials they could afford and the help of 2 neighbors who gave 2 days each, and the result was a standard single-wall structure that was adequate for the purpose it was designed for, which was surviving a normal winter. The second storm of November 1889 was not a normal winter. By the second morning, May's breathing had changed. Margaret had spent enough nights listening to her daughter breathe to know every register of it. The fast, shallow pull of sleep, the slower, deeper rhythm of full wakefulness, the particular note of contentment that came after nursing. What she heard on the second morning of the storm was none of those things. It was a sound with a catch in it, a brief hesitation at the top of each inhale, and May's color had changed, the pink of her cheeks gone to something less certain. Margaret went to get Dr. Foss. She put on everything she owned and walked half a mile through drifts that came to her thighs in the lower ground, and she knocked on Helen Foss's door. And Helen took one look at Margaret's face and reached for her coat. She examined May in the Colton cabin, with the family's one lamp held close and her hands doing what hands do when they have spent 6 years in frontier medicine. The quick, knowledgeable assessment that does not require equipment, reading a body through its surface, listening to a chest through a rolled paper tube, watching the quality of a breath, and knowing what it means. She said to Margaret, "I need her somewhere consistently warm, not warmer than this tonight, better than this all night, every night, until this passes and her lungs recover." She looked at James Colton, who was standing by the stove with his jaw set in the particular way of a young man trying to hold himself together by effort of will. She said, "Your stove cannot do what needs to be done in this structure in this weather. This is not your fault. This is the structure." James said, "What do we need?" Helen said, "You need Reed's cabin." She had already spoken to Gunnar. She had gone to him the previous afternoon, before the storm hit its full force, with a practical question stated plainly. If this storm is what it looks like, and the single-wall cabins in this community fail to maintain adequate interior temperatures, is your structure capable of supporting additional occupants? Gunnar had looked at her and said, "I built it for more than one person." She had understood the weight of what he meant by that, and she had not pressed it. James Colton looked at his wife. Margaret was already wrapping May in the wool blanket, the practiced, efficient motion of a mother who has made a decision and is moving. They arrived at Gunnar's door in the early afternoon, James carrying May and Margaret carrying the bag she had packed in 10 minutes. Gunnar opened the inner vestibule door before James could knock. He had seen them coming through the window. He stepped aside and said, "Come in out of the wind." They came in. Gunnar took their outer coats and hung them on the wall pegs, and Margaret sat down with May close to the stove, and James stood in the middle of the room, looking at the thermometer on the wall, reading 51 degrees, and something in his face did the thing that faces do when a person has been carrying a weight long enough that putting it down feels almost physical. August Heller came 2 hours later, alone, on foot, which at 74 in 38 below zero was an act of such concentrated stubbornness that it took Nora Hatch, who arrived just behind him on horseback, having seen him from her window, several minutes to fully articulate how angry she was about it. She had gone to him that morning and told him what Helen had said, and he had refused to be moved, saying he had survived 4 Wyoming winters and was not going to impose himself on a man he barely knew. Then the wind had shifted and hit the north face of his cabin, and the interior temperature dropped 6 degrees in 40 minutes, and August Heller had put on his coat. He came through Gunnar's vestibule door with his hat in his hand and ice in his beard, and the particular dignity of a very old man arriving somewhere he had not intended to need to arrive. He looked at Gunnar and said, "I am not helpless." Gunnar said, "I know that." He handed him a cup of coffee. Dr. Helen Foss came next, carrying her medical bag, because she had decided early on the first morning of this storm that she was not going to spend 9 days riding between failing cabins in 45-mile-per-hour winds, when the only structure in the township that was performing adequately was a single location. She could do more for everyone by being inside it than by being on the road. She arrived, assessed May's condition with professional efficiency, noted the temperature with professional satisfaction, and took the corner nearest the east wall where she would have light enough to write in her records. Nora Hatch came the following morning with her notebooks and her thermometers and the particular purposeful calm of a woman who has identified the most useful place she can be and has gone there without drama. She had left her cabin shuttered and her stove banked, and she did not expect to return to it until the storm released them. Walt and Thomas Briggs came on the second day of the full storm. Thomas came first, on his own, with a bag and his own notebook, and 10 minutes later, Walt appeared through the vestibule door, alone, without Thomas, having made his own decisions separately and carried it here on his own terms. He came in and looked at the 11 people in the cabin and then at the thermometer reading 50 degrees, and then he sat down at the far end of the room and did not speak much for the rest of that day. The Brenner family, whose youngest boy was fighting an ear infection in a cabin that could not hold its temperature, sent word that first afternoon through Thomas, who rode by their place on his way from the Briggs homestead. William Brenner brought his wife and son through the drifts on the second morning. The boy bundled so thoroughly that only his eyes showed above the wrapping, and they came through the vestibule door into the warmth, and the boy looked at the thermometer with the uncomplicated amazement of a child who has just discovered that the world he thought he knew has another version. That made 11 people in a 14 by 18-foot space. It should not have worked. But the double-wall system that had been built for the thermal load of one person absorbed the increased heat output of 11 bodies with something close to indifference, the interior temperature rising from its normal 51 degrees to a sustained 57 during the daylight hours and settling back to 53 at night, which was the warmest that 11 people in Clearwater Flats had been between the hours of midnight and dawn since the first storm of the season. May Colton's breathing changed on the third day. Margaret heard it before anyone else did, because she was a mother, and mothers hear these things first. The catch at the top of the inhale was gone. The color in May's cheeks was back, that particular pink That means a small body's circulation is working properly and warmly and without strain. She was eating well. She was sleeping without the shallow, anxious rest of a body fighting cold, sleeping the deep, unconscious way of a child who has no immediate problem. Margaret sat in the corner of Gunnar Reed's cabin with her daughter asleep against her chest, and she cried quietly the way women cry when the crisis has passed and there is finally a moment to feel what the crisis was. Helen Foss watched this from across the room and wrote in her records, "Interior temperature maintained above 50 degrees throughout the night without additional fuel load beyond standard banked fire. Patient May Colton, 7 months, respiratory presentation improving significantly by day 3 of exposure to consistent warmth. Recommend documentation of structural specifications for inclusion in territorial health guidelines." August Heller slept. He slept the way he had not slept in weeks, deep and without the coughing that had been waking him every 2 hours, his chest moving in the slow, steady rhythm of a man whose lungs were doing their job in air that was not trying to freeze them. He woke on the 3rd morning and drank his coffee and watched the storm through Gunnar's window and said to no one in particular, "I would have made it another winter." Nora said, "I know you would have," he said, "but it would have been the last one." Nobody answered that. Walt Briggs had been quiet through the first 3 days in a way that was different from his normal quiet, which was the quiet of a man who had already decided what he thought and was waiting for others to catch up. This was the quiet of a man who was recalculating. He sat near the east wall and watched the room and said little, and sometimes he watched Gunnar, and sometimes he watched August Heller, and sometimes he looked at the thermometer for a long time without looking away. On the 4th night of the storm, the wind reached its highest sustained speed of the entire event, 50 miles per hour, measured by the county anemometer, and the outer wall of Gunnar's structure absorbed it with the same indifference it had absorbed everything else. The fibrous fill in the cavity trapping the cold air in pockets too small to circulate. The log wall behind it sitting in its band of stillness, the interior holding. Everyone else in the cabin was asleep by 2 in the morning. Everyone except Gunnar, who was at the stove feeding it its last log before morning, and Walt Briggs, who was sitting in the chair by the east wall with his hands around a cup of coffee and his eyes open. The 2 men were alone, in the way that men are alone in the middle of the night when everyone around them is asleep, which is a particular kind of alone that sometimes produces honesty by default, because the usual social architecture of the day is absent, and there is nothing to perform for and nothing to defend. Walt looked at August Heller, sleeping in his bedroll, the old man's chest rising and falling in that slow, steady rhythm. He looked at him for a long time. Then he said, without preamble, without looking at Gunnar, "I had a friend named Carl Hansen." Gunnar sat down at the table across the room. He waited. Walt said, "This was the winter of 1882. 7 years ago. Carl had a claim 20 miles north of here. Single-wall cabin, good chinking, decent stove. Same as everybody. We had a storm that January that ran 8 days. Cold like this one." He paused. Carl ran out of wood on day 5. He started burning furniture on day 6. They found him on day 9. The wind worked against the outer wall. The fire held its coals. The room was still. Walt said, "I had read something in an Iowa farming paper about dead air insulation, about building a second layer around a cabin and filling the gap with dry material. I had read it, and I had thought it sounded like a reasonable idea, and then I had done nothing with it." He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "I did not suggest it to Carl because I did not want to be the man who showed up with a farming paper idea that all the other men in the county would laugh at. I did not want to be the man who made the fence around a house. He stopped again. He picked up his coffee and put it down without drinking. He said, "I have been laughing at you since April because it was easier than remembering Carl." The words went into the room and settled there in the quiet and the firelight. Gunnar sat at the table, and he did not fill the silence with anything. He understood that this was not a moment that wanted a response. It was a moment that wanted to be heard. He had had his own version of it, standing in a Minnesota cabin with his hand on a cold wall while his wife slept behind him, and he knew what it cost to carry that kind of knowledge, the specific weight of having known something and not done it, and then living in the world that came after. He poured coffee into Walt's cup without being asked. He put the pot back on the stove. He sat back down. Walt looked at the full cup. He said quietly, "How do you live with it?" Gunnar thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "You build the wall." Walt looked at him. Gunnar said, "You cannot go back. You can only build the wall now and let the next storm find it there." Walt was quiet for a long time after that. The fire held. The outer wall took what the wind brought. August Heller breathed in the slow, steady rhythm of a man who was going to see the spring. At some point before dawn, Walt Briggs said, "I want to learn the whole system, every part of it." Gunnar said, "I know. We will start in the morning." The morning after Walt Briggs said what he said, he was up before anyone else in the cabin. Gunnar heard him before he saw him, the careful, quiet movement of a large man trying not to wake 11 sleeping people, the deliberate placing of feet, the slow turn of the stove handle. Gunnar lay still in his bedroll and listened, and did not announce that he was awake because Walt Briggs had not asked for an audience. He was doing something private in the way that men do private things. In the early dark, before the world required them to be the version of themselves that other people knew, he was feeding the stove. He was feeding it with the specific attention of a man who has just spent the night understanding something he did not understand before, measuring the wood with his eyes, placing it with care, adjusting the damper by increments, watching the draw. He was studying the fire the way a student studies a text, looking for the thing inside it that explains the result on the outside. After a while, he straightened and stood, looking at the thermometer on the wall. 54 degrees. He had fed the fire once, and the room was holding at 54 degrees, while outside, the anemometer at the county road station was recording 47 miles per hour, and the temperature had not risen above 30 below since the storm's peak 2 days ago. He turned and saw that Gunnar's eyes were open. Neither man said anything for a moment. Then Walt said quietly, so as not to wake the others, "Show me the damper setting you use for an overnight bank." Gunnar got up and showed him. That was where the teaching began. Not in a formal moment, not with announcement or ceremony, but at a cast iron stove at 5 in the morning while 11 people slept around them, and the wind worked steadily against the outer wall and found, as it always found, that the structure behind it had not moved and was not going to. The storm held for 5 more days after that conversation, 9 days total, which was the longest sustained cold event that any living resident of Clearwater Flats could remember, and which Nora Hatch would later document in her quarterly report as the most significant weather event recorded in Laramie District since territorial records began. On the 7th day, when the temperature outside reached its lowest point of the entire event at 41 below zero, the interior of Gunnar Reed's cabin held at 51 degrees with a banked fire that had last been fed at midnight. Walt Briggs recorded this himself. He had his own notebook now, borrowed from Thomas, and he was writing numbers in it with the methodical commitment of a man who has decided that if he is going to understand something, he is going to understand it completely. He wrote the time, and the outside temperature, and the interior temperature, and the fuel load. And then he walked to each interior wall surface and held his hand against it and wrote what he felt, cool or cold or neutral. And he was building in his notebook the same empirical picture that Gunnar had been building since October, the documented proof that a structure could be designed to make the weather's worst work irrelevant. Thomas watched his father do this and said nothing. He understood that his father needed to arrive at this understanding on his own terms, needed to be the one holding the pen rather than the one being shown someone else's notes. Thomas had spent a year at the Colorado School of Mines learning to be precise about structures and materials and forces. And one of the things that precision had taught him was that a man who builds his own understanding owns it in a way that a man who is given someone else's understanding never quite does. His father was building his own understanding now, one temperature reading at a time, and Thomas was not going to interrupt that. May Colton had been in Gunnar's cabin for 6 days when she laughed for the first time. It was a small sound, the uncomplicated laughter of a 7-month-old who has found something unexpected and delightful. In this case, the shadow that August Heller's hand made on the log wall, when he held it at a certain angle near the lamp. August had not intended to entertain the child. He was simply moving his hand to reach for his coffee, and the shadow had moved with it on the wall, and May had watched it, and then produced the laugh, sudden and complete. August looked at her. He looked at the shadow of his hand. He moved it again, slowly, and the shadow moved, and May laughed again. And August Heller, 74 years old, veteran of Chickamauga, 4 Wyoming winters, and a lifetime of not asking for help, made the shadow move a 3rd time, on purpose. Margaret Colton watched this from across the room, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not diminish it. James put his hand on her shoulder, and they watched the old man and the baby in the lamplight, and the cabin held its warmth around all of them, and the storm worked against the outer wall and did not get through. On the 9th day, the wind stopped. It did not taper. It did not gradually diminish through the afternoon to a manageable breeze by evening. It simply stopped between 1 hour and the next, the way Wyoming winter sometimes ends its statements abruptly and without apology, leaving a silence that felt enormous after 9 days of sustained sound. The sky cleared to a blue so deep it looked almost violet at the edges, and the sun came back with the particular brilliant coldness of post-storm light on snow. Everything sharp and white and still. The 11 people in Gunnar's cabin opened the outer vestibule door and stood in the doorway and looked at it. The world outside was rearranged. Drifts had buried fence lines and covered the lower halves of outbuildings and filled in the spaces between structures with a smooth white reconfiguration that made familiar distances look wrong. The snow was crusted hard enough to walk on in most places, which was both useful and treacherous. Useful because it meant movement was possible again. Treacherous because the places where the crust gave way were invisible until you found them with your foot and went through to your thigh. People began moving back to their own claims over the following 2 days by ones and twos, carrying what they had brought and returning to assess what the storm had left them. The news from most claims was the same. Wood supplies depleted further than planned. Interior walls showing frost damage that would need to be rechunked in spring. In 2 cases, outbuildings had lost sections of roof under the snow load. The work of recovery was substantial and immediate, and it occupied people's hands and attention in a way that was, in its own way, a mercy, because it gave the body a task at the precise moment when the mind needed one. Walt and Thomas Briggs were among the last to leave Gunnar's cabin. Thomas went first in the morning of the second day after the storm broke, taking his notebook and shaking Gunnar's hand and saying, with the directness that was a Briggs family trait, regardless of the generation, "I will be back tomorrow. We are not finished." He meant the learning. He meant the documentation they had been doing together in the back of Thomas's notebook during the storm days, the full specification of the Reed system that Thomas had been compiling with Gunnar's input, the cavity dimensions and fill densities and ventilation ratios and material costs expressed in the formal technical language of someone who had been trained to write things that could be replicated by someone who had never seen the original. Walt left an hour after Thomas. He stood at the inner vestibule door the way he had stood at it in October, with his hand on the latch and his back to the room. But this time, he turned around. He looked at Gunnar across the room. At the table where Gunnar was writing in his notebook. At the cabin that was 14 by 18 feet and built from the same materials as every other cabin in Clearwater Flats, and yet had spent 9 days demonstrating what the difference between one wall and two felt like when the weather made its full argument. He said, "I owe you more than I can say." Gunnar looked up from his notebook. He said, "You do not owe me anything." He meant it without qualification. He was not being modest. He was being precise. Walt Briggs owed him nothing. What had been demonstrated here had been demonstrated for everyone in that cabin, and the debt it had created ran forward into the future, not backward between two men. Walt said, "Carl Hansen." Gunnar nodded. Walt said, "I am going to build the wall." He meant it in the practical sense. The actual construction he was already planning for the spring. The outer frame and the fill and the vent slots that would wrap his own cabin in the same system that had kept 11 people warm through the worst 9 days in the recorded history of Laramie District. But he also meant it in the other sense, the sense that Gunnar had offered him in the dark at 2 in the morning, the only available response to the thing that cannot be undone, to build the wall now and let the next storm find it there. He went out through the vestibule, and Gunnar heard the outer door close, and then there was only the quiet of the empty cabin. The first time it had been quiet since the Coltons arrived, and Gunnar sat at his table in it for a while without writing anything. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date, November 15th, 1889. And beneath it he wrote the final temperature readings of the storm period. And beneath those he wrote a single line that was not data, which was unusual for this notebook, which was almost entirely data. He wrote all 11. Then he closed the notebook and went outside to check his outer wall for storm damage. The recovery work of December moved through the community in the way that frontier recovery work always moved, collectively and without formal organization, people showing up at each other's claims with tools and labor, because the implicit understanding of that life was that the winter would eventually test everyone, and the only insurance against it was the person standing next to you. Roofs were repaired, chinking was replaced, wood supplies were inventoried, and the people who were short were supplied by those who had surplus, not as charity, but as the practical management of a shared resource in a shared predicament. Gunnar worked alongside his neighbors during this period, and was worked alongside in return, and the social geography of Clearwater Flats shifted in these weeks in ways that were not announced but were real. The man who had built the fence around a house was now simply the man who knew something useful. And knowing something useful in a frontier community conferred a different kind of standing than being right about an argument. Being right about an argument made people resentful. Knowing something useful made them come back. Walt Briggs came back on the 3rd day of December with a wagon, and Thomas beside him, and lumber stacked in the wagon bed, fresh cut from the Rawlins mill, and he drove it to August Heller's claim, and they spent 4 days building the old man an outer wall. They did not ask Gunnar to direct the work. Thomas had his notes, and Walt had his new understanding, and between them, they had enough to proceed. But Gunnar came anyway, the first morning, and walked the perimeter of what they were building, and looked at the post spacing and the ledger block intervals and the gap width, and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Your fill access panel on the south face is going to be hard to reach when the fill settles. Move it 6 inches to the left." Walt moved it 6 inches to the left. He said it without hierarchy, the observation of one builder to another about a problem the second builder had not yet seen. Walt received it the same way, incorporated it and moved on, and that exchange established something between them that had not existed before, the working relationship of two men who were on the same side of a problem. August Heller watched them build his outer wall from his window. He watched Walt Briggs, the county land supervisor who had spent 15 years being the man who knew this country, nail battens onto the plank skin with the careful precision of a student, measuring his intervals, checking his plumb, doing the work with the full attention it deserved. He watched Thomas move through the construction with the fluid competence of someone who understood the principles deeply enough to adapt them in real time, solving small problems as they arose without interrupting the forward motion of the work. On the second day, August came outside and stood in the cold and watched from the yard. On the third day, he asked Walt if he could nail one of the battens himself, and Walt handed him the hammer without comment. August drove 3 nails, each one true, and handed the hammer back. He said, "I want to know the full system." Walt said, "Thomas will teach you." Thomas spent an hour that afternoon walking August through the cavity dimensions and the fill material and the ventilation logic, and August asked good questions, the questions of a man who had been building and fixing things for 7 decades and understood the language of structures, and Thomas answered them straight, and by the end of the hour, August had the conceptual picture complete enough to explain it himself if he had to. Dr. Helen Foss documented August Heller's respiratory function every 2 weeks through the winter. The first measurement after the outer wall was complete showed an improvement in his peak airflow that she described in her notes as clinically significant. The second measurement, taken in January during the coldest 2-week period of the winter, showed continued stability rather than the decline she had been tracking every previous winter. She wrote in her records, "Patient sleeping through the night without coughing interruption for the first time in 3 years. Interior temperatures in the retrofitted structure maintaining above 48 degrees at floor level throughout overnight periods. Attribution to structural improvement, direct and demonstrable." She added a note in the margin, in smaller writing than her usual clinical script. "Patient told me this morning that he heard a bird outside and thought for a moment it was spring. It was not spring. He is simply warm enough to notice things other than the cold." She did not include that note in the official records, but she kept it. Nora Hatch finished her report in February. It was 14 pages, which was longer than any quarterly report she had previously submitted to the Territorial Education Office, and it was organized in the way that the Education Office's standard template required, with sections on weather events, attendance impacts, and infrastructure recommendations. The infrastructure recommendations section was 9 pages long and contained everything: the full technical specification of the Reed double wall system, the temperature data from both storms, the fuel consumption comparison, the medical outcomes documented by Dr. Foss, and the results of the retrofits that Walt and Thomas had performed on 3 additional structures through December and January. She had written and rewritten the technical section 6 times. She wanted it to be precise enough that a builder reading it could reproduce the system without needing to visit Clearwater Flats, and she wanted it to be clear enough that a county commissioner reading it could understand what the numbers meant without needing to be a builder. She sent it to Gunnar for review, and he read it carefully and returned it with 4 corrections, all of them small, all of them about numbers that she had slightly misremembered, and 1 marginal note that said only, "This is good work." She sent it to the Wyoming Territorial Education Office in Rawlins on February 18th, 1890. She expected to hear back in a month, which was the normal response time for quarterly reports. She heard back in 11 days, which was not normal, in a letter from the assistant commissioner that said the infrastructure section had been forwarded immediately to the Wyoming Agricultural Extension Service and the Territorial Land Office, both of which had been looking for exactly this kind of documented field evidence for construction standards in high-wind regions. The letter asked for the name of the originating builder and his formal credentials for inclusion in the Extension Service bulletin that they intended to publish. Nora brought the letter to Thomas first. She was not certain why she went to Thomas before she went to Gunnar, except that she had a sense, developed over the months, of watching the Briggs family reckon with what the winter had taught them, that Thomas was the right person to be in the room when certain decisions were made. Thomas read the letter twice. He set it down on his table and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I want to prepare the formal submission." Nora said, "That would be appropriate. You have the complete technical documentation." Thomas said, "I am going to name it the Reed method, the technical designation. Reed method for thermal cavity wall construction in high-wind climates." Nora said, "That is the correct name." Thomas picked up the letter. He said, "I am going to ask my father to sign the sponsorship attestation. The Extension Service requires a county-level official to attest the credibility of field submissions. My father is the county land supervisor." There was a pause. Nora understood what Thomas was doing and what it would require of his father to do it. Walt Briggs signing a document that attested to the credibility of a construction method he had publicly dismissed for 6 months, signing it to place it formally into the territorial record under a name that was not his own, signing it in his capacity as the official who was supposed to know these things. That was not a small thing. That was a large thing dressed as a procedural requirement. She said, "Does your father know you are planning to ask him?" Thomas said, "Not yet. I wanted to see the letter first." He went to his father that evening. He brought the letter, and he brought his technical documentation, and he sat across from Walt at the kitchen table, and he laid it out plainly, the way the Briggs family laid things out without softening. He said, "The Extension Service wants a formal submission with a county attestation. You are the county supervisor. I need your signature on the attestation page." Walt looked at the letter. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, fully from the beginning, not skimming. He read the technical summary Thomas had prepared, which was thorough and accurate and which described the Reed method in terms that were clear enough for any builder to follow and precise enough for any engineer to respect. He set the papers down. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about things that took a while to think about. He said, "The name." Thomas said, "Reed method." "Yes." Walt said nothing for a moment. He looked at the attestation page at the bottom of Thomas's document package, the line where his signature would go, the line that said, "County Supervisor, Laramie District," and beneath it, the line that said, "I attest that the construction method described herein has been field tested and verified in Laramie District, Wyoming Territory, and represents a significant improvement in thermal performance for residential structures in high-wind, cold climates." He thought about Carl Hansen. He thought about 11 people warm through 9 days. He thought about August Heller hearing a bird in February and thinking for a moment it was spring. He thought about May Colton laughing at the shadow on the wall, alive and pink-cheeked and breathing easy in warm air. And he thought about what that child's life had cost and what it had not cost, and why the difference between those two things was a wall that one man built and another man laughed at for 6 months. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. He did not explain it, and he did not elaborate on it, and he pushed the paper back across the table to Thomas and said, "Make sure the specifications are complete. I do not want them to have to come back and ask for more." Thomas said, "They are complete." Walt nodded. He said, "Good." Then he went back to reading the farming paper he had been reading when Thomas came in, and the conversation was over. The following morning, Thomas rode to Gunnar's claim with the signed attestation and the full submission package, and he set it on Gunnar's table and said, "My father signed the sponsorship attestation. The submission goes to Rawlins next week." Gunnar looked at the papers. He saw his own name in Thomas's careful handwriting at the top of the method designation, Reed Method. He saw Walt Briggs' signature at the bottom of the attestation page, the signature of the man who had told him in April that one good wall with tight chinking was all any man needed, the man who had spent 6 months riding his circuit and shaking his head, the man who had lost Carl Hansen in 1882 and carried it for 7 years before a 9-day storm, and a conversation at 2 in the morning gave him somewhere to put it. Gunnar stood at his table and looked at that signature for a long time. He thought about what it took for a man like Walt Briggs to write his name on a paper like that. Not the physical act of signing, which took 3 seconds. The other thing. The thing that happened in the space between picking up the pen and putting it back down. The private accounting of what you believed against what the evidence had shown you. The willingness to let the evidence win. Gunnar had spent his whole working life in the company of men who could build things, and he knew that building something you could see and touch was the easy part. The hard part was building something inside yourself, dismantling what you were certain of, and replacing it with what was true, and doing it without anyone needing to ask you to. Then he put on his coat. He walked across the 1.5 miles of crusted February snow between his claim and the Briggs homestead without planning what he was going to say when he got there, because what needed to happen did not require words, and he knew it. Walt was in the yard when he arrived, working on a frozen pump mechanism that had seized during the last cold snap, his breath making small clouds in the still air. He heard footsteps and looked up and saw Gunnar coming across the snow toward him. He straightened. He set down his wrench. He waited with the stillness of a man who knows what is coming and has decided not to run from it. Gunnar walked up to him and stopped. He looked at Walt Briggs for a long moment. This man who had been the first to dismiss him and the last to understand him, and who had in the end signed his name to a piece of paper that would carry Gunnar's work forward into the territorial record and beyond it, into the hands of builders and commissioners and extension agents who would use it to keep people warm in winters that had not happened yet. He looked at Walt, and he thought about Carl Hansen, and he thought about Ingrid, and he thought about the particular mathematics of lives that might have been different if someone had done one thing differently at one moment, and how the only answer to that arithmetic was to do the thing now, with the time that remained. Gunnar put out his hand. Walt looked at it. He looked at it, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Then he took it. Not a quick professional handshake, but a real one, the grip of 2 men who have been through something together and know it and are not going to pretend otherwise. They held it for a moment longer than courtesy required. Then they released. Walt turned back to his pump. Gunnar turned back toward his claim. Neither man said anything, because neither man needed to. The February yard was quiet around them, the snow hard and white in every direction, the sky that deep Wyoming blue that only comes after a long storm has finally cleared and left the air absolutely clean. The Extension Service Bulletin came out in April of 1890. It was a 12-page document distributed to county supervisors, agricultural agents, and rural school districts throughout Wyoming Territory. And it contained among its recommendations for the upcoming building season a 4-page section on the Reed method for thermal cavity wall construction, complete with diagrams and material specifications, and a summary of the documented field results from Clearwater Flats. Walt Briggs received his copy at the county office in Rawlins on a Tuesday in April. He read it in the office, and then he rode home with it in his coat pocket. And that evening he sat at his kitchen table and read it again. He looked at the diagrams, which were Thomas's work, clean and precise. He looked at the temperature data table, which was Nora's, organized with the same care she brought to everything she documented. He read the field summary, which described in formal bureaucratic language the events of October and November 1889, the storms, the comparative temperature readings, the medical outcomes, the fuel consumption differentials. He turned to the last page, where the method was formally attributed Reed method, originating builder Gunnar Reed, Clearwater Flats, Laramie District, field-tested and verified through 2 major storm events, October and November 1889, attested by Walter Briggs, County Land Supervisor, Laramie District. He sat with the bulletin in his hands for a while. Then he folded it and put it on the shelf where he kept the things he intended to keep. Spring came the way it comes to Wyoming, not gradually, but in a series of decisive statements. The snow retreating to the north-facing slopes, the creek ice going in a week of warm afternoons, the ground emerging from under its white covering in dark, wet patches that smelled like the thing the earth had been doing under the snow all winter, continuing regardless. Gunnar opened his fill access panels in May and checked the condition of the cavity material. The hay and moss in the inner sections was dry, which confirmed that the vent slots had done their job throughout the winter. The outer sections showed some moisture absorption in the northwest corner, where a batten joint had worked slightly loose during the second storm. He noted this, made the repair, and added it to his notebook under the heading of Maintenance Observations, which was a category he had started after the first winter as a way of documenting what the system needed in order to continue performing. He spent the early weeks of May riding his claim and turning the soil in the sections he had not been able to break the previous year, the practical work of a homestead that had been deferred through 2 seasons of construction and then survival. The soil was deep and dark and broke clean under the plow, and there was something satisfying about it that was different from the satisfaction of the building work, less precise, more elemental, the feeling of returning to the ground, the attention it had been waiting for. In the evenings, he sat on the step outside his vestibule door and watched the light go out of the sky. The days were long now, and the light lasted until almost 9, that particular long Wyoming twilight that made the distance look soft and close. He could see, from his step, the Briggs homestead, 1.5 miles north, and the outer wall that Walt and Thomas had added to it through the winter, the vertical planks visible as a slightly different shade against the log structure behind them. He could see, further west, the Morrison Place, and beyond that, the Colton claim where James had started framing his own outer wall in April, working afternoons after the fieldwork was done. Thomas riding over twice a week to check his progress. He could hear, some evenings when the wind was right, the sound of hammers from 2 or 3 directions at once. In the first week of June, Nora Hatch came by on her way back from the Rawlins post office with a letter that had arrived at the county distribution point addressed to Gunnar Reed, Clearwater Flats, Laramie District. She brought it out because she knew he came to town infrequently, and the return address on the envelope was the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Extension Service in Cheyenne, and she thought that was the kind of letter a person would want promptly. He opened it at his table while she sat across from him. It was from the Extension Service's chief agricultural engineer, a man named Pendleton, and it said that the Reed Method Bulletin had been well received by county supervisors across northern Wyoming, and that 2 counties in Montana Territory had already requested copies. It said that Pendleton's office was preparing a second bulletin, expanding the documentation to include schoolhouse construction, which was the application Nora had originally suggested in her quarterly report, and that they would like Gunnar's cooperation in providing additional technical specifications. It also said that Pendleton intended to visit Clearwater Flats in August to examine the original installation and meet the originating builder. Gunnar read the letter twice and set it on the table. He looked at it. Nora said, "That is significant." He said, "Yes." She waited. She had learned, in the months of working with this man, that his silences were not empty, that he was using them for something, and that interrupting them produced less than waiting did. He said, "I want Thomas to be there when Pendleton comes. Thomas should be part of that conversation." Nora said, "I think Walt should be there too." Gunnar said, "Yes, Walt too." She wrote Pendleton's office with the reply, and the August date was confirmed, and she added it to her records with the same care she gave everything she put on paper, the specificity of the committed documentarian who understands that what gets written down is what survives. There was one more thing that happened that summer that Nora did not document, because it happened in a private moment, and she only knew about it because she happened to ride past at the right time. It was an evening in July, the light going long and golden the way Wyoming light does in high summer, the air still and warm for the first time in what felt like a year. She was returning from a visit to the Heller claim, where August had shown her his kitchen garden, with the pride of a man who has time for a kitchen garden, because he is not spending all of it managing a failing stove, and she came along the track that ran past Gunnar's claim on its south side. Gunnar was sitting on his step outside the vestibule door. He had a notebook open on his knee, but he was not writing in it. He was looking out at the field, at the Briggs homestead, visible in the middle distance with its outer wall, at the Colton claim beyond that, where the new outer frame was up and the planking was going on. The sound of James Colton's hammer carried faintly across the flat ground. He had something in his other hand. She could see it from the road, a small book, different from his notebooks, older looking, its cover worn at the corners from handling. She did not stop. She did not want to interrupt the moment, which had the quality of a private thing, a man in a particular stillness that was not sadness and not contentment exactly, but something between them or past them, something that did not have a common name, because it was too specific to one kind of life. She rode past quietly. What she could not have seen from the road was what was on the open page of the small old book in his hand. It was a pencil sketch, faded now and softened at the edges from years of handling. It showed a simple rectangle, a building, with a second rectangle around it at a small distance, and between the 2 rectangles, a gap indicated by careful parallel lines. It was not a professional drawing. The hand that made it was not a builder's hand, but someone who had learned drawing for pleasure rather than precision, and the lines had a quality of curiosity to them, of someone working out an idea rather than recording a finished plan. Ingrid had drawn it in the 2nd month of their first Minnesota winter, sitting at the kitchen table in the cabin he had built too fast and too thin in the urgency of that autumn. she had found a farming paper from Iowa in a box of household goods they had not yet unpacked, and she had read the section on dead air insulation in commercial ice storage, and she had come to him with it that same evening, her face carrying the particular contained excitement of someone who has just understood something that changes how she sees everything around her. They had already been living in the single-wall cabin for 2 months by then. She had already felt what it felt like to sleep in a structure that was losing the argument with the cold. She knew exactly what she was reading about when she read it. She had drawn the sketch right there at the table and shown it to him and asked, with the precision she brought to questions she already half knew the answer to, why did they not build houses this way? He had said, because it costs more and takes more time, and nobody thinks they need it until they do. She had looked at the sketch for a long moment. Then she had looked at the walls of the cabin around them, at the logs conducting cold inward in the January night, and she had written beneath the sketch in the particular contained excitement of someone who has seen the plain essential shape of a thing and cannot unsee it. She had written 2 walls, because one was never enough, and then below that, because the people should live in the quiet. He had not built the second wall that winter. He had not built it because January was already there, and the work was too large for the time remaining, and because part of him had thought they would have the following autumn to do it properly, the way it should be done. They had not had the following autumn. By the following autumn, he was alone, and the cabin was sold, and he was on a train west with 2 trunks and a notebook full of measurements, and the small book with the pencil sketch inside it. He sat on his step in the July evening and held the book open to that page and listened to the hammers. The sound carried from 3 directions now. James Colton on the west, the Morrison family on the north, who had started their own outer frame the week before with Thomas's help, a 16-inch cavity this time, fuller than Gunnar's original. And from the south, barely audible, the beginning of work on the Sandoval claim, where the youngest family in the township had decided not to wait for another winter to tell them what this one had already said. He listened to the hammers, and he thought about what Ingrid had written, that one was never enough, and he thought that she had been right in the way she was usually right, seeing the plain, essential shape of a thing before the argument about it was finished, before the evidence was in, before the winter delivered its verdict. She had seen it sitting in a cold cabin in January, reading a farming paper from Iowa, and she had drawn it on the kitchen table, and she had handed it to him. He closed the book. He looked out at the field, where the evening light was going long and warm across the grass, the same light on the same ground that had looked so bare and exposed when he drove his first stake into it 14 months ago, that had seemed to offer nothing between a man and everything the weather could do to him. It looked different now, not because the ground had changed, or the distance had shortened, or the wind had learned to behave, but because in the middle distance and the far distance and the near distance, there were walls going up, second walls, outer skins of rough-sawn plank, with their battened seams and their vent slots and their 12-inch cavities of still and trapped and patient air, walls that would take whatever the winter brought to them and hold it there, outside, away from the people living in the quiet behind them. He opened his notebook to the current page and picked up his pen and wrote the date and the temperature and the wind direction and the fuel consumption for the day, the same 4 numbers he had been writing every day since October, the continued record of a system performing exactly as designed. Then he looked at what he had written and added a 5th entry at the bottom of the column, which was not one of his standard categories and which he had never written in this notebook before. He wrote 7 cabins. Then he put the pen down and sat in the summer evening and let the hammers do their work.